Let me tell you what we're going to do today. I'm going to talk to you about the book and give you kind of a sense of what it was all about. I'm going to then make some comments about today and the relevance of some of the things that happened in 1970 to what may be going on today. I talk about this period of the late 60s and early 70s as the best of times and the worst of times. It was the best of times because change was occurring, and I was a young person, and change looked good to me, and change looked even better to people who were younger than I was. But unfortunately, at the same time the change was occurring, violence was occurring. And there was a great deal of violence in this period. And that was not good, but it may have been a product of what has to happen when change occurs. May Day 1970 is when Yale and New Haven were faced with what looked to be the largest single radical demonstration of the period. There had been lots of demonstrations around the country of large groups of people, but this was forecasted to be the largest ever. In my talk to you today about this event, I'm going to use the word radical frequently. And I want to tell you my definition of radical, because I think some people today have an idea that a radical is somebody with long hair and sort of old clothes using four-letter words. And that's not my definition of a radical. My definition of a radical is a person who passionately believes in something that is generally not believed in by society. So the greatest radical of all in this period for me is Martin Luther King. And he was the man who passionately believed in the rights of every citizen, and there were a whole lot of people in this country who didn't agree with him. So when I use the word radical, that's what I'm referring to. Now, these were times which are often called the anti-war period. I prefer to call it the era of the challenge to authority. And that phrase is not mine. It comes from the Port Huron Manifesto, which is a document that was written in the early days of this radical period, mostly by Tom Hayden, but some other people as well, and was the charter, if you will, of that whole revolutionary period. But what was going on at the same time as the Vietnam War? Think of Rachel Carson's book in 1968, The Silent Spring. This was the first public mention of the terrible things that were happening to our environment. Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique is really the document that begins the modern feminist movement. There was, of course, the Civil Rights Movement with Martin Luther King and so many other people that was going on. The Vietnam War was going on. It was terribly unpopular. People didn't understand why we were there, what we were doing, what we were trying to accomplish. The Stonewall Riots in 1969 were the first time the gay and lesbian community were asserting their rights to the American dream. And all of these protests, which are in general led by younger people, were undermined terribly by three events. The assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. Here you had a young, vigorous president very symbolically replacing the man who had gotten us through the Second World War, an older man, revered and respected, but nevertheless, he was the old generation. And John Kennedy comes along and represents a new generation and change. And then, in April of 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated. Certainly, I think to most people who study the period, the greatest radical of them all, the greatest leader. And then 3 months later, Bobby Kennedy is assassinated. And Bobby Kennedy, to me, was a kind of amalgam almost of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King, because he was the politician, he was a vigorous political leader and so on, but he had a passionate belief in helping the poor and the downtrodden. And I think those three assassinations made people just extremely angry, particularly younger people, because they saw the youth leadership that they had so admired being taken right out from under them. It's interesting that Yale's first protest, first challenge to authority, was in 1964, when a group of students and faculty protested the failure of the philosophy department to promote a young man named Richard Bernstein, who was a very beloved teacher, also a considerable scholar, but the department decided he did not merit promotion to tenure. And it was the first time that we experienced the idea of large groups of people gathering outside the administration building and challenging the actions of the older generation. Now, why were Yale and New Haven the targets of this proposed massive protest? In the late 1969, a young black radical, a member of the Black Panthers from another city, was kidnapped by 3 New Haven Black Panthers. Warren Kimbrough, who some of you may subsequently have known, a wonderful man. Warren Kimbrough, George Sams, and Lonnie McLucas. And they kidnapped Alex Rackley and brought him to New Haven because they believed he was an informer for the FBI, a fact that turned out not to be true. They tortured him for 3 days. They murdered him and took him up to Middletown and took his body up there and left it. The murder was discovered quickly by the police, and the 3 who had committed the murder were arrested quite quickly. They confessed and ultimately were sent to jail. I should say that Warren Kimbrough, one of the 3 murderers, after he came out of jail, graduated from Harvard College and got a master's of social work and came back to New Haven and was a very positive force in the New Haven community. But the murder of Alex Rackley by those 3 men would not have caused a very big blip on any screen. It might have been just a headline in the New Haven Register for a day. But it certainly in and of itself was not something that was going to cause a major event. There was a prosecutor in town by the name of Arnold Markle, and Arnie Markle decided that he could just clean the whole thing up, in his words, by indicting the entire Black Panther leadership, starting with Bobby Seale, but also for New Haven, a very significant woman by the name of Erica Huggins. And Erica had come from California originally, but she married Johnny Huggins, the son of one of New Haven's most prominent and respected black leaders, John Huggins. And Johnny and Erica lived in California, and Johnny was shot by the police out there and killed. And Erica brought his body back to New Haven and decided to stay here, even though she was one of the Black Panther leaders and they were in general were headquartered in Oakland. But Erica stayed here. But Arnie Markle decided to indict the entire Panther leadership. We don't know what it was, but something triggered a coalescence of all the leaders of the major radical groups in the country, not just the Panthers, but all of the major radical groups came together. And if you'd gone to any city in America in March and April of 1970, you would have seen posters saying, "Go to New Haven, we're going to free Bobby Seale, and we're going to burn Yale down." And that appeared everywhere. Now, why was Yale chosen to be burned down? It was primarily because Yale represented the elite white sort of East Coast of America. And it seemed like if you're going to be in New Haven and you're going to free Bobby Seale, you might as well take care of that place as well. And so we became part of this, even though we had had no active role in the things that had led up to it. And we were told that there would be somewhere between 30 and 100,000 people who would be coming to town to visit. As we thought about this, we realized we had three threats. The first was, in a sense, the threat of the past, and that was that we had watched, those of us who worked in the university, had watched other universities go through terrible times. Harvard, Columbia, University of Pennsylvania, any number of universities had had these smaller protests which had turned into bloodlettings. People's heads were bashed, people were arrested, buildings were burned. And so we saw that the kind of thing that could happen to you in a situation like this, except ours was going to be maybe 10 times bigger than anyone else had had. So it was a rather frightening thought. Secondly, we learned over time that every single major national radical leader was going to be here. So you think of people like Kathleen Cleaver. Kathleen Cleaver was a black woman who was a Panther, but she was also active in a lot of other radical causes, one of the most articulate speakers I've ever heard in my life. And parenthetically, today she is a half-time professor in the Yale Law School and the University of Virginia Law School. Jean Genet, which is a name that many of you may not know, Jean Genet was an older man at the time. He was born in France. He grew up in poverty. He became a petty criminal, went to jail. And when he got out of jail, he educated himself and later became a very respected philosopher in the academic world of philosophy. But he also was the man who wrote most of the idealism of this period. And so all of the radical leaders adopted the ideas of Jean Genet, but he was going to be here too. Dave Dellinger, who was a well-known radical of the period, Anne and John Freunds, who both were part of the radical movement, Allen Ginsberg, the poet and philosopher, planned to be here. Abby Hoffman, who was the founder of a very considerable organization with a funny name. It was the Yippies, the Youth International Party, and I can't remember what the other letters stand for, but it was a major radical organization. And Abby Hoffman was going to be here. He also was the first marketing man for marijuana. He never went anywhere without a marijuana symbol on his shirt or his hat or something like that, and he was a great promoter of the legalization of marijuana. Jerry Rubin. Jerry Rubin was the radical leader who learned, at a time when not many people thought about it, the advantages of sort of PR and marketing and public relations. And so when the House Un-American Activities Committee invited him to appear before, they didn't invite him, they subpoenaed him to appear before them, Jerry arrived at the hearing room dressed in a magnificent uniform of an American Revolutionary soldier. And it so befuddled the members of Congress they canceled the hearing and never heard from him. Tom Hayden, I leave to last because Tom was perhaps the major leader in different areas. He was the co-author of the Port Huron Manifesto. He was the founder of the Students for a Democratic Society, known as the SDS. He was the first American to illegally go to North Vietnam to try to help bring about a peaceful solution. And he was later elected to the California state legislature, I think as a senator, where he served for a considerable time. Now, all of these people were coming to New Haven, and they were as able leaders as you could find in the United States. They knew how to get people to do things. They were great speakers. They were able to make things happen. I forgot one, Artie Seal, Bobby Seale's wife, who was an extraordinary woman. She's still alive, and she is planning to write a book about this time, which I'm dying to see, but she also was a very articulate leader. So they were all coming. So first we had the threat of our history of what had happened in universities. Then we had the threat of the left. But what turned out to be the most significant threat was not either of those, it was the right. Now, what do I mean by that? Unfortunately, when Dick Lee became ill and had to resign the mayoral job of New Haven, he was succeeded by the president of the Board of Aldermen, Bartholomew Bart Gaida. And Bart, who was fundamentally a very good man, had a very narrow vision, and he hated Yale. He hated Yale with a passion. And I think you could argue he may have hated Yale with some good reason, because those were the days in which Yale did nothing for the city of New Haven. So he may have had some reason on his side. But I knew his police chief very well. I'm going to talk more about him in a minute. But Bart called his chief in and said, if there's any violence during this weekend, you are to funnel it all onto the Yale campus. So you can see what he was thinking about. Secondly, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had made noises about the thought that if one of the elite campuses were to explode, it would move some of the people in the center of the country to the right, which is what he wanted for the 1972 election. Kingman Brewster and I spent 25 years on freedom of information inquiries, and we did indeed find memos between Nixon and those two, Haldeman and Ehrlich, about this issue. And wouldn't it be a good idea if one of either Harvard, Yale, or one of those universities exploded? J. Edgar Hoover. He had been brought in by Nixon and promoted the same idea with Hoover. And I had a very good friend here in New Haven who was the local CIA agent, a man named Ed Barnard, and he wasn't a spy, he was a recruiter. He was trying to recruit mostly Yale students to go into the CIA. But Ed Barnard absolutely detested the FBI. He thought they were the worst organization in the world. So he would come in and tell me everything that the FBI had told him. And they had told him they were tapping my phone and the Brewster's phone and other people's phones. So we knew the FBI was a bit of a threat on the side as well. Then, of course, Nixon asked Spiro Agnew, that admirable vice president, if he would go around the country preaching that Brewster should be removed from office. And as you may remember, Agnew made headlines saying this over and over again, going across the country. Now, last on the right, unfortunately, were the Yale alumni. The Yale alumni were not happy with Kingman Brewster in general, but they were particularly unhappy when he heard how he was going to handle May Day weekend. And they became very active and critical and made life exceedingly difficult for those of us who were trying to make this whole thing work. So it was clear we had some planning to do. And we did have a little less than 6 weeks, because we learned of the indictments, I think March 20th, something like that. So we had until May 1st to make a set of plans. As I mentioned, Jim Ahern and I were very good friends, and we decided on the old good cop, bad cop strategy. And Yale would be the good cop, and New Haven would be the bad cop. So let me tell you a little bit about Yale's planning. The first person that Brewster and I talked to was a man named Archibald Cox, who you will remember became Solicitor General of the United States. And at that time, he had the same job at Harvard that I had at Yale. He was Nathan Pusey's assistant and had been in charge of all the operations of Harvard during their moments of unrest. And we were so paranoid at the time, we decided we had to meet someplace secret. And so we met Archie Cox in a field out in Sturbridge, Massachusetts, near the old Sturbridge Inn or whatever it's called. We had a picnic in a field. And I should tell you, I don't know if any of you here knew Mary Louise Brewster, but she was quite an elegant lady, and she was given the job of preparing the picnic, and we didn't even know what was in it. But we got there, and Kingman opened this basket, and there was cold squab and champagne Not exactly what you would expect to have on an occasion like this. Archie Cox said really only one thing to us. He said, if you do what everyone else has done, and you lock Yale down, and you have a crowd of that size, you will be destroyed. You'll lose your jobs, the buildings will go, you'll probably have people killed, and it won't work. And that's all we could think about as we drove back from Sturbridge to New Haven, was the advice of a very wise man who told us what we could not do, but he didn't tell us what we could do. After considerable discussions with our deans and our faculty and the students, and I might parenthetically say that in 1963, Yale began to admit a far larger group of black students, and we had the most magnificent group of young men and women here as students, and they were phenomenal in their leadership and in their advice to us. And so we consulted everybody, and we came to the conclusion that the only policy that would work would be to do the reverse of what everyone else had done. So we put out the word that we would welcome the radicals, and we would welcome them to come and to stay on the campus. And we told them that we would open all our courtyards. You know, Yale has the residential colleges, and the graduate and professional schools are all based around courtyards. That we would open all those courtyards up, and they would be welcome to stay. And we would feed them 3 meals a day. And we prepared to feed 100,000 people 3 meals a day with, I'm sorry to say, the same menu for each meal. And the menu was rice, granola, and water. So that word got out. Then we had to work to bring the students with us. And so we made each facility, each college, and each graduate school campus had a purpose. So the Pearson College was the college in which the health care, if you needed Band-Aids or you were sick or whatever, and we had people staffing them. And then in Davenport College, where the master was director of the Yale University Child Study Center, that was the child care college. So if children were lost or needed to be taken care of. So everybody had a role. And one of the masters, a professor of biology named John Trinkus, who was an incredible radical himself, but he loved motorcycles, and he had 2 of them. And so we assigned all the motorcycle radicals to Branford College. And there may have been 400 motorcycles in the middle of that college. But everybody had a job to do. The black students became the leaders of the entire student body. They fanned out into the New Haven community. New Haven had had, just 2 years before, terrible riots and problems in the Hill section in particular. And a lot of buildings had been burned, and those dear people in that community did not want any more of this. And so they welcomed the fact that we were all going to try to keep this thing peaceful if we could. New Haven, being the bad cop, was led by James Ahern. The mayor, having told his police chief what to do, kind of receded into the background. And Jim was really in charge. And Jim Ahern was a man years ahead of his time. He had studied riot control. He had studied all the modern methods of police that were known at the time. He was a genius. I remember him telling me, he said, Sam, if you have looting, and you have 5 or 6 people who are looting a store, there's always going to be a leader. So the goal is to get undercover, non-uniformed people to go in and get that leader and get him out. And then the rest of the thing will fall apart. Well, he had a series of theories, such as this. And the 2 of them, which resounded on this weekend, were, you don't want people to see uniforms. And the second is, nobody should have a bullet in a gun. And I'll come back to those in a minute. So he had the governor send 5,000 National Guardsmen. And in the book, you'll see some wonderful pictures of the Guard marching right down York Street here. And 500 state police officers were brought in, the Yale and the New Haven police, which totaled about 600, and then the Marines sent a unit to Quonset, Rhode Island, with helicopters to bring them down in the case they were necessary. Kingman Brewster had a classmate named William Kunstler, and Bill Kunstler was probably the most prominent lawyer representing radicals and radical causes of that generation. And we contacted Kunstler and asked him if he could arrange for us to meet the major radical leaders whose names I just mentioned to you, who were going to be in town. And he set that meeting up. And at 3 a.m. on May 1st, that would be in the very early morning before the protest rally was to occur, we met at Kingman Brewster's house. And we met to try to reach a deal. And the deal was reached about 5:30 in the morning, and the deal was fairly simple. They agreed that they would go ahead with the rally, that they would make their speeches, they would be angry, and they would call us four-letter words, but at the end of every speech, the speaker would say, "We need violence, but not today. There should be no violence today, but in the future, there's going to be trouble." We, in return, promised two things, and that was that we would do everything in our power to see that, that no uniform could be seen on the New Haven Green. And the second was that none of the guardsmen would have bullets in their guns. They could have bullets on their belts or in pouches or whatever, but nobody would have a bullet in a gun. So at 5:30 we broke up. The rally occurred in the afternoon. I have one vivid memory of at 5:30 when Jerry Rubin was saying goodbye to Kingman Brewster, and he threw his arms around him and said, "Kingman Brewster, you are the best. You're the best." And maybe 6 hours later, he was standing at the podium saying, "Effing Kingsley Brewer." So they kept their word. They actually also smuggled out of the jail, and remember that Bobby Seale was actually being held in Haddam. He wasn't here in New Haven. They didn't tell anybody at the time, but they smuggled out of the jail a tape recording from Bobby Seale in which Bobby said, no violence today. No violence today. If you look at the pictures in the book, you will not see a uniform anywhere. All the guard was moved back into the Grove Street Cemetery and Park Street, State Street. No uniformed policemen were present. There were some non-uniformed policemen, but not many. If you look at the pictures in the book, you see people who are not angry. There are people chatting with each other. They seem to be enjoying what's going on. The speakers are speaking, but there's no anger. It has been diffused. And so by the end of the afternoon, 35,000+ people gently went back to their rice and their granola and their lettuce, and the next day they went home. I want to tell you a couple of sort of parting words about this section, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about today. I learned one thing that has never left me, and that is that today's radical idea may be tomorrow's gospel. And if you think of the things I told you about that were being protested in 1970, the environment, women's rights, so on, I think most of us believe those are rather good ideas today. And yet in 1970, the majority of the country did not agree with them. So today's radical idea may be tomorrow's gospel. And when you hear a radical idea, it's well worth taking some time to think about it for a bit. I want to also give you just two short quotations from Kingman Brewster, because he was an extraordinarily able leader. The first was a sentence he used, I think I heard it from him 150 times over the course of his presidency. Never let disagreement fester into disrespect. And that is the way he acted. When a radical came in and had an idea that Kingman didn't like, The radical went out believing he'd been listened to, that he'd been respected. He didn't maybe get the agreement he wanted, but he felt he'd been heard. The second is a quotation which comes from a speech that Kingman gave, and it is actually, if you ever go to the Grove Street Cemetery, it is engraved on the, I think they call it a coping wall around the gravesite where he and his wife are buried. The presumption of innocence is not just a legal term, but rather the commonplace belief in the goodness of the stranger. And that, too, was his philosophy. So May Day weekend ended. We had no violence, and we decided that a week later, the following weekend, we would have a big party for the whole campus in order to celebrate what everybody had done, the students, the faculty, the community. And 4 days later, before we had our party, a scared National Guardsman with a bullet in his gun shot and killed 4 students at Kent State and wounded 9 others, and we did not have our party. Now, let me turn to the second part, and we still have some good time left for questions. Having told you about May Day 1970 and what happened, let's go back and sort of analyze what transpired and whether we can learn anything from it for today. In doing so, I want to distinguish the 3 components of that event in what I am going to call a cycle. The first component is outrage. The second component is protest. And the third component is the reaction of authority. Let's look at each. I looked up outrage in the dictionary, and I first looked it up in Webster's, and then I looked it up online. And interestingly enough, the first definition in both places was crime. You know, it's an outrage that somebody stole my car. It's an outrage that somebody burned down your house. But the word crime apparently is what is most associated in our society with the word outrage, and I think that's worth remembering. The word we're talking about, which is the second definition, is indignation. You're really upset about something that's going on, and particularly when there's an inequity in society. You become indignant that those people are being treated that way, or that this is happening, or that the income gap is so incredible between the rich and the poor. A protest is, in this context, is what happens when people who are outraged cannot get the results they want. So they try something on their own and it doesn't work, so they get a bunch of people together and they say, let's go protest and get relief, get this problem changed. And the reaction of the authority is what happens when we're outraged and we get up there and we yell and we scream, and then the boss, the president, the policeman, whoever it is, reacts. And this is a cycle, if you think about it, that's been going on for all of human life. So we know from history that when people are outraged, and particularly about societal inequity, and they have a protest, there's a very high degree of violence resulting. And if the reaction of authority is to do one of 2 things, the most common 2 things is for authority to either do nothing or to use force to make the protest stop. What that does is to inflame the outrage, and that's when people lose control, and that's when violence reacts. We've fallen, I believe, into a frame of mind that's saying that outrage is a bad thing, that outrage is a crime. And I think that's why the dictionary puts it that way. You should all read this little book. And I tell you, it's little. It's tiny. It's just 40 pages of text. There's an introduction which isn't worth reading, but the text is brilliant. And it was written in French, and the original title was Indignez-vous, or Be Outraged. The translation, the English version is called Time for Outrage. And this was written by a man named Stefan Hessel. And Hessel, who died a few years ago at age 95, was a Jewish resistance fighter in the Second World War, who caught by the Nazis, sent to both Buchenwald and Dachau, survived both, and he later was one of the co-authors with Eleanor Roosevelt of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Hessel believes that outrage or indignation is fundamentally a good thing and is absolutely essential to society if society is going to make progress. You have to have people saying, no, we have a good society, but we've got further to go. And it's the outraged people who make that happen. In matters of human inequity, Hessel says, and I quote, "You as an individual are responsible. People must commit themselves, they must be outraged, in terms of personal, individual human responsibility. When we see inequity," Hessel says, quote, "the worst possible outlook is the indifference that says, I can't do anything about that." So I think today we've got to look carefully about what's happening in our society and whether we individually and collectively have a role that may actually involve outrage. When it comes to protest, I don't think there's any doubt that almost everybody in America believes that protests should be allowed so long as they're nonviolent. And Hessel, like Gandhi and King, believe in nonviolence. But protests must be protected. If we look at authority, as I've already suggested, when a group is outraged about an inequity, they're pleading for change. That's what's happening. They want something to change. And it's clear that in the late 60s and early 70s, we saw around us as we were planning for May Day that authority seemed to always react the same way, which is to either do nothing or come out with the troops and try and stop it. We saw the beginning of evidence in the late 60s and early 70s of a willingness to try to cure this cycle. Young people flocked to the South to work on voter registration. They were outraged, they acted individually and collectively, and they took enormous human risk in doing it. In 1968, young and old alike became so outraged with the war in Vietnam that they protested, and when the authority failed to react, they brought Lyndon Johnson down, nonviolently. At May Day itself, the Panthers and others were outraged with the indictment of Seal and his colleagues. There was protest, and Yale and the city of New Haven tried innovative methods for responding to protest, and for the most part, it brought peace. If we have problems today in the Fergusons, the Baltimores, the Clevelands, and possibly New Haven, I believe we must see it as the fault of each of us individually and collectively. We seem unwilling to take risk of being personally and collectively outraged at the inequity and doing something about it. We make rather pathetic protests, and authority has the same old-fashioned way of saying, go away. This cycle of outrage, protest, and unsatisfactory authoritarian reaction is a very dangerous cycle. Thanks again, I appreciate it.